Why is it important for people who are good listeners to also have really good boundaries? And oftentimes you will see these two concepts taught in the same training, the same course, and there's a really important reason for that, which is basically that people in today's society are starved for good listening. So when they find someone who will actually listen to them and listen to them well, there is a tendency to sort of come in and take without a two-way relationship, without attention to the other person's needs. And so people who are good listeners can find themselves in situations where they're in unhealthy relationships or relationships that are sort of sucking from them spiritually, which of course is bad for both people because it's not a mutual relationship. It's not something that the listener has chosen to give. If there aren't good boundaries in place, then good listeners can be manipulated, they can be taken advantage of, and so these two skills are important to be taught together. So in this video, I'd like to talk first a little bit about why we're so starved for good listening and how that plays out in people's relationships. And then I'll talk about two things that can go wrong in relationships when the listener doesn't set good boundaries. And then finally, I'll try to paint a picture of what it would look like for a good listener to set boundaries. And just to be clear, the definition of boundaries that I like to use for this channel is that it's a budget for emotional and spiritual energy, so that you're the one deciding where to give your emotional and spiritual energy. And to do that, you're taking into account what kinds of relationships fill you up, what kinds of relationships take from you. And it's okay to give to relationships that aren't two-way, as long as that's your choice about where to give your energy. You get to allocate that energy however you want. And you don't want people coming in and choosing how to spend your emotional and spiritual energy for you. You want that to come from your own agency. Okay, so first, why are people so starved for good listening? And I think this has a lot to do with the online space. The online space is essentially an attention economy where platforms compete for our eyeballs because, of course, they sell our eyeballs to advertisers. So because of that, if we want to be heard by a real human being, we have to compete with that online space. And as the online space sucks up more and more of our attention, there's less and less of that attention to give to each other. So from a supply and demand standpoint, there's an undersupply of good listening and an over demand for good listening because people are feeling lonely. They're feeling like the only people that hear them is people on a screen, which might be a robot, and that just doesn't feel good. Also, as we spend more of our social time online, we're losing some of the social skills of reading people's body language, of responding in the moment to a three-dimensional human being. We're losing the skill of being patient when someone's thinking through something and trying to get a thought out and they can't quite articulate it and need a little bit of patience. We're losing all of those skills. So people are just super hungry for good listening. So if you learn and practice good listening skills, you have basically a superpower that a lot of people will want. But the danger for you if you become a good listener is that people will discover this and they will be so hungry for your attention that they will come in and take your attention without your permission. So why is that a problem? Because I'm making the case that it's a problem for both people if they find themselves in one of these relationships. There are a couple of key reasons it's a problem. One is that the good listener who's being taken advantage of can't sustain that forever. They're going to want out of that relationship, and oftentimes these end with sort of a cutting the person out of your life in a way that is painful to them. And Brene Brown, who is a social work professor who has observed these dynamics for years, has made the observation that the most compassionate people are also the most boundaried. And I think this is one of the reasons for that, is if you're going to give compassion, people are going to want that. And if you're not good at setting boundaries, then you will end up cutting a lot of people out of your life abruptly for them, and that can hurt them as people as well. And the other thing that can happen if you don't set good boundaries as a good active listener is that you end up in these one-way relationships where one person does all of the talking and all of the receiving of care, and that is not reciprocated. And that definitely does not feel good on the part of the person who's always listening and never receiving any attention or care. And that can suck up energy. Like when you're not the one deciding how you spend your time, how you spend your energy, it's someone coming in and just sort of taking over. That's not a healthy relationship. And what that means is that you'll have less energy to give other important people in your life. So setting good boundaries means you sit down, you decide, where do I want to allocate my spiritual energy? And that accounts for which relationships are fulfilling to me, which relationships leave me filled up in a way that I can give more to the world, give more to other people who are in need, and which relationships suck the energy from me. And sometimes you do need to give to relationships that are one way, relationships where you feel drained after spending time with the person because that person is needy, because that person is a relation, and you care about them. You've decided intentionally that's a relationship that you're going to give, even though you're not receiving as much. That's perfectly okay. But that needs to be your decision rather than the decision of the person who comes in and dominates their time. And when it's your decision, it doesn't usually suck as much time and energy from you because you're like, yep, I'm going to spend 2 hours with this person. And I know I'll feel a little bit drained afterwards, but it's a decision I've made that's in line with my values. And I feel good about that. So it will still drain you a little bit, but not nearly as much as if you feel like you have no agency. So what do good boundaries look like for someone who's a good active listener? And I think they have a few important traits. One is that you're open and honest with people about what you have to give and the limits of what you have to give. And this could be as simple as saying, you know what, I only have 15 minutes right now, or something like that. That can be a very simple way of setting that boundary. Other times this can look like sitting down with the person and saying, hey, I really love you and I appreciate you and I enjoy my time with you, but I'm also feeling drained when I leave our conversations. And part of the reason here is that the relationship doesn't feel reciprocal. I feel like you don't know as much about me as I know about you. Can we do something to fix this relationship so that it works better for both of us? And of course, that's a really hard thing to do, but if you get good at negotiating your needs in a relationship, it can be really rewarding. Another thing about good boundaries in this sort of situation is that the person is aware of when they start to feel manipulated or when they start to feel like the other person is taking them for granted or choosing how they spend their time for them. When you become aware of that, doing something about it, being clear with the other person, communicating with the other person, structuring your time differently, all of those strategies can be brought into play. But first you have to recognize when you're feeling manipulated. Now, that's all about people that you want to keep in your life. And keep in mind that most boundaries are designed to help you maintain good relationships. They're not designed to cut out relationships. They're designed to make sure the relationships work well for both people. But you can't have an infinite number of friendships. And if you're a good active listener and people know that, there's going to be more people wanting your time than you actually have time for. And so some people you do actually need to say, you know what, I don't have time to add a new relationship to my life right now. You need to say no to people, and that's okay. And the final thing to consider here when you're thinking about active listening is, who do you actually engage in active listening with? Obviously, you want to do this with anyone who's a regular part of your life. And a lot of times it's really fun to do this with strangers. You can really go deep with strangers fast if you're a good active listener, but you don't necessarily want to do this with everyone, because very often the result of active listening with someone who's a stranger or someone you're just meeting is that they want more of you. And if you find yourself constantly having to say no, to say, wait, I don't have time for more relationships, then you're probably demonstrating this skill to people who really don't need to see that part of you. Because when you active listen with someone, it feels to them like you're inviting them in. And if that's not your intention, you could be sending messages to people that are not exactly what you intend. So only active listening when there's at least some possibility that you might want to go deeper with someone. That's something that's kind of important. So those are just a few quick thoughts on why is it important that good active listeners also get really good at practicing good boundaries. And those two skills, by the way, are some of the two most useful skills that I've ever learned in my life. They're both worth spending the time and spending the energy getting good at.